How's it going, guys? Hey, another devotional for this week in reestablishing truth. Last week we discovered what truth is. This week we discover what truth is not. So first, let me do a review. Truth is something that corresponds to the reality that God has placed before us. Truth is something that conforms to the external reality in front of us. Number two, truth is discovered. Number three, truth applies to everyone, regardless of their age or their gender or where they're from, what culture they belong to, when they've existed. When something is true, it's objectively true for everyone, regardless of whether they agree with it or disagree with it. And also, finally, truth is less ultimately found in an idea, and truth is more so found in a person. In other words, the standard of what is true, good, and right is bound up in a determiner of that truth. Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." Truth is found in the person of God. So something can't be true and also contradict the very person of God and what he's placed before us. But now we move into what truth is not, and we find in John chapter 8, verse 32, Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, and you'll be free indeed." Well, I only need to be set free from something if I have previously been enslaved to something. So if the truth sets me free, then what is it, by default, what is it that enslaves me? What enslaves me is anything that is lacking truth. The Bible says that the devil is the father of lies. The Bible says that he is a deceiver, or he is the deceiver. So any time that we are enslaved to something, it's because we are enslaved to a lack of truth that ultimately the enemy has placed before us. So a couple of things for today. What is truth not considered? Truth is not to be considered truth if it's pragmatic. In other words, just because it may work doesn't mean that it's good and it's right and it's healthy. I can become rich by robbing banks, but it doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. It doesn't mean that it's the integrity-filled thing to do. So truth is not pragmatic. It's not just, that it works in the moment. Also, truth is not something that's merely understandable. Some people can get together and they can create a conspiracy about how the earth is flat, but that doesn't mean that it's correct. Just because that a logical argument is given does not necessarily mean, or just because it's understandable, it doesn't mean that it's true. Just because it makes sense in the moment doesn't mean that it's true. Third, a truth is not necessarily what makes you feel good. You could actually receive a phone call with bad news and it still be true. You could get news of a loved one passing away, and that's bad news, but it's objectively true. You could also think of it like this: truth is not based on a majority. 9 out of 10 students attend public school, and in public schools they teach evolutionary theory, which means 90% of our society is learning evolutionary theory. That doesn't mean that 90% is agreeing with it, but it looks as if the majority is teaching evolutionary theory. Just because a majority is teaching something doesn't make it true. You could have 99 people believing and teaching something and one person disagreeing with it, and that one person can be right. So majority or numbers don't necessarily determine truth. Also, truth is not necessarily comprehensive. You can have an eloquent speaker, you could have someone with countless PowerPoint slides and supposed amounts of data. You could have someone up there giving a TED Talk, but that eloquent TED Talk with lots of data and PowerPoints and information doesn't make something true. Also, truth is not necessarily true just because someone has good intentions. With critical race theory, you may have a heart or a compassion for a certain ethnic group, but in standing up for that ethnic group, you have used a message that comes from cultural Marxism, which is not true, and therefore you're trying to help people with an evil, poisonous message. Marxism cannot provide value on people's lives, but God provides value on people's lives. So just because there's good intentions doesn't mean that something is true. Just because there's compassion doesn't mean that it's true. In fact, there's something called malevolent compassion. You can actually compassion people to harm because you're unwilling to give the truth. Also, I would say this: truth is not necessarily always publicly known. This kind of goes along with the majority aspect of things, but truth can be private. In other words, it might be true that there is a treasure that's hidden off somewhere and it's undiscovered yet. Just because it's undiscovered doesn't mean that it's not there. So at the end of the day, I think this is what happens. When something is not true, it's because it has been created by people. When something is true, then it can ultimately be discovered by God. So real truth is discovered, counterfeit truths are created. And that's probably the biggest difference. You know, there's a book that came out called Strange New World by Carl Trueman, and he makes the case for today's expressive individualism. In other words, people in today's society are elevating internal truth, what feels good for them on the inside, rather than things that correspond to external truth. And I think that's dangerous, and I think that's why you might have men believing they're women and women believing that they're men, because what they're doing with external reality is they're pushing it aside because they're valuing internal reality, which to them brings them to an ultimate place of freedom and genuineness. In other words, they're able to fully express how they feel regardless of what's externally true. That's a dangerous world to be living in. And I think it's dangerous mainly because of this reason. Not only is it harmful for the person who views their own internal reality contrary to the external reality of God, not only is that harmful to the individual, but once you start thinking of your own self in a certain way that doesn't correspond towards reality, you can also start thinking of other people in such a way where things are not true about them, and then you start thinking of other people in ways that don't conform to external reality. So you'll notice right now that there's a massive transgenderism movement in our country, and that's one's view of themselves. But what happens when we also start viewing people wrongly based on our own internal feelings, such as pedophilia? You know, what happens next when someone says, well, they might look like a child, but I'm going to view them as an adult. So that's really the next digression in evil, is we move from one's internal elevated sense of reality towards now placing that internal reality on top of others, or presupposing those inner realities upon others. That's why these things are so evil. They don't correspond to what God has said. They don't correspond to the structure and the order that God has placed in society. When something is not true, it's because it has been created by mankind, and it has ultimately lost sight of the fact that God is the ultimate definer of truth. We can discover what God has placed there, but once we start recreating truth and we start creating our own forms of evil, we get into a lot of trouble. And that's when we become enslaved to something that's not true. Jesus said, though, that the truth will set you free, and you'll be free indeed. All right, that's today. That is what is not considered to be true. God bless.